Indonesia invaded East Timor December 7th, 1975. At the time, it was President Ford, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. They flew into Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. They gave the go-ahead for the invasion to one of the longest reigning dictators in the world, Suharto. And as they flew out, the Indonesian military invaded East Timor by land, by air, and by sea, just for a little history. They occupied the country, they closed it to the outside world, and for the next 17 years, or ultimately for about a quarter of a century, they slaughtered the people. One of the great genocides of the late 20th century. The genocide was worse than Pol Pot's Cambodia. The difference was, in terms of people knowing what was happening, Americans knowing, is that Pol Pot was an official enemy of the United States. The president would say that, the Secretary of State, so the media would cover it because the president and Secretary of State would talk about it. And of course, the media should have covered it. But in the case of Indonesia invading East Timor, Suharto was an ally of the United States. And so whether it was Ford and Kissinger, onto Carter, onto Reagan and Bush, and onto Clinton, they didn't talk about the atrocities in Timor. So we went to East Timor to do our job as journalists, to go to where the silence is. And what we found there was a real hell on earth. November 12th, 91, Indonesia had occupied for 17 years. They killed a third of the population, 200,000 Timorese. And on that morning, the people went to church, to the Catholic Church. Most of the country is Catholic. It had been occupied by Portugal for many centuries, actually. And they went to the Multi-Al Church, the flagship church in Dili, the capital of East Timor, about 300 miles above Australia. And they, after the church, went out into the street in an unheard of demonstration, because in Indonesian-occupied Timor, they didn't allow freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. But 2 weeks before, right after we arrived, the Indonesian military had surrounded the church, and they had killed a young man named Sebastião Gomez in the church at point-blank range. They had a funeral for him the next day. We went, and 1,000 people turned out and marched to the cemetery. And then 2 weeks later, they were having a commemoration procession. In this land without freedom of speech, press, or assembly, the people marched into the streets. You would see a girl in her Catholic school uniform, and then a woman in her old Timorese garb. And the girls and boys would pull out banners that they'd written on bed sheets, and they would hold them up, and they would say things like, "Why the Indonesian military shoot our church?" They appealed to President George H.W. Bush at the time, who was here. They appealed to the UN, someone to stop the slaughter. And they marched through the streets of Dili, retracing the steps of the funeral 2 weeks before. Some putting their hands up in the V sign, chanting, "Viva East Timor, Viva Independence, Viva Sebastião." Incredibly brave to do this. And they marched, thousands joined from schools, from work, from home, and they marched to the Santa Cruz Cemetery. When we got there, we were interviewing people. Why are you risking your life to do this? And they would say, "For my mother, for my father, for my village, it was wiped out." And then from the direction the procession had come, we saw hundreds of Indonesian soldiers carrying their US M16s at the ready position, marching up in the crowd. You know, when Indonesia invaded, 90% of the weapons used were from the United States. The Indonesian army was armed, trained, and financed by the United States. And on this day, it was no different. The soldiers marched up 10 to 12 abreast. Alan and I were interviewing people in the middle of the crowd. And Alan suggested we walk to the front of the crowd, because although we knew that the Indonesian military had committed many massacres in the past, they'd never done it in front of Western journalists. And we thought maybe, just maybe, our presence could head off this attack. We always hid our equipment, because anyone caught talking to a Western journalist could be disappeared, could be killed. But this time, we wanted to make clear who we were. I took my tape recorder out. I slung it over my shoulder. I put my headphones on. I held up my microphone like a flag. Alan put the camera above his head. Alan was writing for the New Yorker magazine at the time. We walked to the front of the crowd. The soldiers marched up. They rounded the corner. They swept past us. And without any hesitation, without any warning, without any provocation, they opened fire on the crowd, gunning people down from right to left. A group of soldiers gathered around me. They pulled my microphone away, waving it in my face as if to say, this is what we don't want. And then they took me down, beating me with their rifle butts and boots. Alan had gotten a photograph of them opening fire, and then he threw himself on top of me to protect me. They took their US M16s, they slammed them against his skull until they fractured it. So we were laying in the road, Alan was covered in blood. The soldiers then put the guns to our heads in firing squad fashion. And they shouted two things. They'd now stripped us of everything. The only thing I had left was my passport and my skirt, and I threw it at them. And they were shouting two things: Australia and politique. They were shouting politique because they were saying it was political for us to witness this. But that's our job as journalists, to go to where the silence is. And they were asking if we were from Australia, chanting, Australia, Australia, and we knew how dangerous that was for us. 17 years before, when Indonesia invaded East Timor, there were 5 Australian-based journalists that were covering the invasion. The Indonesian military lined them up against a house in a town called Balibo, and they executed them all. There was a 6th journalist, and the day after the invasion, December 8th, 1975, his name was Roger East. He was reporting from a radio station in Dili for the World. He was the last Western journalist there. And they broke into the radio station, they dragged him out, and as he shouted, "I'm from Australia," they shot him into the harbor with so many thousands of Timorese. The Australian government hardly protested the killing of their journalists. We believe because years later, Australia and Indonesia would sign the Timor Gap Treaty, dividing Timor's oil between Australia and Indonesia. Oil is the source of so much pain in the world. And so as we lay there, Alan covered in blood, and they're shouting at us, Australia, with the guns to our heads, we shouted back, no, America, America. I had thrown my passport at them. I was born here in Washington, D.C. And they would kick me in the stomach when I'd get my breath back, and as others joined the firing squad, I would say, America, America. At some point, they took the guns from our heads. We believe because we were from the same country their weapons were from. They would have to pay a price for killing us that they had never had to pay for killing the Timorese. A Red Cross Jeep pulled up. We were able to get into it. The driver of the Red Cross Jeep picked up this old Timorese man who was in a sewer ditch next to us. And every time the soldiers beat him, he would put up his hands in the prayer sign and they would smash the butts of their rifles into his face. We drove off to a hospital. Timorese stopped us to try to get away from this killing field, and we drove as a human mass to the hospital as they hung off the spare tire on the back on top of us, on top of the Jeep. At the hospital, when we got out, the doctors and nurses started to cry when they saw us. Not because we were in worse shape than the people that were being dragged there. Young people dragging sisters or brothers who'd been shot but not yet dead, hoping they could be operated on. But I think because of what we represent to the people of Timor, and not just Alan Nairn and I, but I think Americans, and not just to Timor, but people all over the world, I think we represent two things: the shield and the sword. The sword, because all too often the U.S. government uses the weapons, like in Iraq and Afghanistan, or provides them to human rights abusing regimes, like Indonesia. But they also see the American people as the shield. You know, we can call our Congress member and say, don't do that. People can march in the streets here. And they saw that shield bloody that day. And that just deepened their despair. We went into hiding. We knew we had to get out of the country. We had not succeeded in stopping the massacre. The Indonesian military killed more than 270 Timorese on that day. We went to the bishop's house, at the time Bishop Carlos Jimenez Bello. He later won the Nobel Peace Prize. And Alan was covered in blood. And he gave him a new shirt so we could clean him up. His head under his dark hair glistened like a bathing cap of blood. But if we could get to the airport before the new shirt was drenched with blood, maybe we could get out on the only plane out. Get to fly out of East Timor and get word to the outside world. We made it to the airport. They closed down the whole city. The jeeps of soldiers were combing through the streets now. We heard gunfire in other parts of Delhi. Got to the airport. The military occupied the airport because it was a military-occupied country. They were shouting security when we came. We don't know if they had decided not to kill us at the massacre site, and so now they just wanted us out, or if there was a gap in communications. But at some point, they decided to let us get on that plane. Alan had electrical charges going through his body from the beating, had to walk very, very slowly. We walked onto the tarmac, onto the plane, and as the flight attendants closed the plane, they handed me a silver bowl as we were flying out of Timor with water, and they said, clean him up. We made our way to West Timor, which is Indonesia, and then to Bali. Made a call to the West. Alan reported in detail what had taken place, and when we were in hiding, we had someone take 18 pictures of us because they had confiscated all our equipment. We knew that they would deny anything had happened, but then they'd have to explain what happened to us. And I hid that film away. And I had taken a towel from Bishop Bello and wrapped Alan's bloody shirt under it around my skirt so that at least we could show this evidence. And so when we got to Bali and Alan made the call to the West, I kept wiping the phone off because the blood from his head was drenching the phone. We then got onto a flight to Guam, and we went to Guam Memorial Hospital where they operated on Alan, sewing up his head. And it was there in the Guam Memorial Hospital emergency room that all the press from around the world called in. It became a kind of switchboard for the press. The New York Times, the Washington Post, Voice of America, BBC. What happened? What happened here? Of course, Indonesian military denied anything took place. And then an ambulance. Alan never stopped telling the story, even as they were sewing up his head. He had the phone glued to his ear. We were brought to a kind of CNN outpost, a cable studio. Someone developed the photographs that we had gotten out, and we showed them, and we said a massacre has taken place. Came to the United States when we got to Washington after Alan was released from the hospital. Within hours, they re-sewed up his head. We had a news conference at the National Press Club. We described the weapons that were used. We said a massacre has taken place. A nationwide movement grew up around the United States and around the world calling for the U.S. to stop arming the Indonesian regime. In 1999, 8 years later, the Timorese got a chance to vote for their freedom in a UN-sponsored referendum. And in a sadistic goodbye operation, as the people went to the polls in Timor, the Indonesian military burned East Timor to the ground, killing more than 1,000 more Timorese in that voting process. The UN ran East Timor for 3 years, and then on May 20th, 2002, I tried to get in for the referendum, but the Indonesian military caught me going through Bali and Jakarta and deported me. But 3 years later, I came through Australia, and May 20th, 2002 was a remarkable day. Alan Nairn also got into Timor then. It was about midnight. About 100,000 Timorese gathered in Tasitolo, a sandy plain outside of the capital, Dili. Then the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan gave a speech, and then Shanana Gusmao, the rebel leader of Timor, who had long been imprisoned by the Indonesian military, ascended the stage. He was the founding president of the new country, and he unfurled the flag of the Democratic Republic of East Timor. There was this fireworks display. You could see the light reflected in the tear-stained faces of the people of Timor. They had resisted, and they had won at an unbelievably, unacceptably high price. But this nation of survivors had prevailed. And it's a lesson to all of us, 11 years after East Timor was established as an independent nation. Whether we are journalists or business people, professors, doctors, artists, students, whether we are librarians, whether we are employed or unemployed, we have a decision to make every day, every hour of every day, whether we want to represent the sword or the shield.